The air in the northern peak was Lyra's trusted blanket, cold, heavy, and impenetrable. She had not seen a living soul aside from the occasional lost Arctic fox in 3 years. Her breath condensed into tiny frozen crystals against the thick fur lining of her cloak, a necessary boundary between her skin and the volatile, destructive power she carried. She, Lyra Snowveil, the Iceborn Luna, had been born with the curse of crystal breath, capable of freezing a river solid with a burst of uncontrolled anger. It was a power that mandated solitude, a power she feared more than any rogue pack. She sat by the dying embers in her small, isolated cabin, listening only to the whistle of the high winds, secure in her self-imposed exile. Then came the rupture. It wasn't a sound, but a deep, discordant hum that vibrated the very ice in her teeth. The cabin, built to withstand blizzards, shivered, and a hairline fracture ran across the hearthstone. Lyra surged to her feet, the sudden spike of adrenaline threatening to unleash a defensive, killing frost that would encase the whole valley. This tremor was wrong. It felt ancient, hungry, and impossibly far south, near the heart of the Frostwind kingdom. The fear in her gut was not for herself, but for the damage the darkness might inflict. Before the tremors even subsided, a new sound cut through the wind, the sound of heavy, perfectly synchronized paws crunching the snow. The silence had been shattered, and her terrifying magic was no longer hers alone. The king's wolves had found her. Lyra slid the heavy oak door open and stepped onto the snow, instantly channeling a protective sheath of frost around her bare hands. 4 massive, ghostly white wolves, the king's royal guard, fanned out in a perfect, intimidating semicircle, their pale blue eyes focused entirely on her. She met their gaze, her own breath freezing mid-air. She saw their Alpha, Kaelith Frostwind, emerge from the dense pines behind them. He did not shift, nor did he offer a growl of challenge. He stood in the falling snow, a monarch of ice and shadows, his armor dark, his face a chilling mask of authority. Lyra prepared for the inevitable, drawing her iceborn strength, ready to fight for her autonomy until her last breath. She expected a challenge of will, a demand for submission, or the fury of a king wronged. What he offered was far colder, far more disconcerting. Kaelith simply took a single deliberate step toward her, his presence utterly dominating the frozen landscape. Without uttering a word, no demand, no passionate roar, no display of dominance, he extended his hand toward her wrist, his expression unwavering. It was not a plea, but a sovereign command, an act of pure, cold necessity. He didn't want her heart. He wanted the weapon she represented. The silent, non-negotiable claim bypassed all the usual rituals of battle or mating. It was a strategic acquisition, startling Lyra into a stunned compliance that no shouted threat could have achieved. The king had arrived not for a mate, but for a solution. Lyra's resistance melted not under his heat, but his cold logic. As Kaelith's fingers, shockingly warm despite the bitter air, clasped her wrist, he finally spoke, his voice low, gravelly, and utterly devoid of emotion. "I am not here for a mate, Lyra Snowveil. I am here for a defense." "You are not a conquest. You are a solution." He released her, his gaze sweeping past her to the horizon where the unsettling tremor had originated. He spoke of the ancient rift, a catastrophic wound on the edge of the kingdom sealed centuries ago by the first Iceborn, a power that had since been lost to myth. Now, the rift was bleeding shadows, and the chaos would engulf their lands within the moon cycle. "The prophecy," he stated, his eyes finally locking onto hers, cold as glacier ice. said only the next Iceborn Luna could permanently seal it. It requires power, Lyra. Raw, uncontrolled, world-shattering power. Your power. He revealed a small silver capsule from his armor, detailing the immediate devastating consequences of the rift's full opening, the total collapse of the Frostwind Kingdom. He didn't offer comfort or a choice. He offered purpose wrapped in a binding command. You are coming with me to the Citadel. You will be crowned, trained, and used. You are the only thing that stands between my people and annihilation. The weight of a kingdom, the lives of thousands, was violently dumped onto her shoulders, crushing the fragile peace of her isolation. She was no longer Lyra the recluse, but Lyra the necessary weapon, and her first journey began immediate. The Citadel was a fortress carved from glacial ice and sheer rock, a perfect reflection of its king. Lyra arrived not as a bride, but as cargo, deposited by the guard into the vast, echoing Hall of Sovereignty. The difference between her frozen isolation and this suffocating civilization was immediate and jarring. Hundreds of shifters, cloaked in opulent furs, watched her entrance with blatant hostilities. They saw the untamed wildness in her fur-trimmed cloak and the fearful power in her silver-blue eyes. The hostility was quickly personified by Beta Prime Valerius. He was Kaelith's second-in-command, an older, politically powerful shifter whose slick smile did not reach his calculating eyes. "Welcome, Luna," he purred, the title dripping with skepticism as he performed a shallow, mocking bow. He immediately led the High Council in a subtle yet crushing dismissal. They didn't speak to her. They spoke around her, discussing the rift threat as an internal problem that needed a strategic, non-magical solution, clearly dismissing the prophecy in Lyra's role. Valerius's silent message was absolute. Lyra was an unstable variable, a foreign body, and a political liability Kaelith had foolishly risked everything on. Lyra felt the crushing weight of their collective doubt, a different kind of cold than the North's, but no less penetrating. She stood beside Kaelith, a symbol of necessity, fighting the urge to let a defensive wall of ice spring up around her just to keep their judging eyes out. The days that followed were a grueling cycle of isolation and intense scrutiny. Kaelith, true to his word, had her training begin immediately. She was led not to a sparring ring, but to a massive, enclosed glacial cavern, where the only audience was the 4 elite white wolves. Lyra's task was not to fight, but to control. Her magic, previously a wild reactive force, had to become a precise instrument. She practiced building intricate, stable ice structures, then shattering them without collateral damage. The guard watched her failures, their silence more oppressive than shouts. Kaelith, however, was a constant, unsettling presence. He oversaw every session, sometimes standing close enough for his warm breath to ghost the back of her neck, sometimes even placing his hand over hers to guide a specific channel of energy. This proximity was maddening. Their wolf instincts warred. Lyra's Omega need to submit to his overwhelming alpha dominance clashed violently with her iceborn independence. The scent of pine and raw power emanating from him was a constant distraction. Every touch, necessary for her training, sparked a current that was far from icy. The external pressure was forcing her power into control, but the internal proximity to the king was slowly and dangerously thawing the ice she had kept around her heart. She was learning to command the cold, but she was entirely unprepared for the heat he generated. The High Council convened in the Great Hall, the air thick with the scent of old parchment and hidden animosity. Beta Prime Valerius stood before them, his posture impeccably neutral as he dissected Lyra's training records, presenting her volatility as proof of Kaelith's recklessness. "The Iceborn is a weapon without a safe hilt, Your Majesty," Valerius stated, his voice ringing with false concern. "Her very presence invites disaster. We must vote to isolate her before she shatters us all." Lyra felt the familiar surge of shame and fear threatening to escape in a reactive burst of ice. She focused on Kaelith, standing stone still beside her, meeting the council's judgment with absolute calm. Just as the elder was about to call the vote, a subtle shift in the shadows near the balcony caught Lyra's peripheral vision. It wasn't a wolf. It was a glint of metal and a blur of speed aimed directly at Kaelith's throat. Instinct, sharper than any training, took over. Before Kaelith could even fully shift, Lyra reacted. She didn't unleash a deadly storm. She executed a surgical protective defense. A wall of shimmering, impossibly smooth ice erupted from the floor, not around her, but between the king and the projectile. The assassin's dagger struck the crystalline shield with a dull thud, deflecting harmlessly. The hall plunged into stunned silence. Lyra's breath hitched, but the cold control held. She looked at the king, safe behind the shield she had created, and understood. Her power was not inherently a curse. It was a perfect, life-saving fortress, and she had built it for him. The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of royal guards and frantic damage control. But later that night, in the privacy of his personal chambers, the facade of the unfeeling Alpha King finally cracked. Kaelith dismissed his guard and turned to Lyra, the cold edge in his eyes replaced by a raw, startling vulnerability. He didn't thank her with words. His gratitude was expressed in the tremor of his hand when he reached out, not to claim her, but simply to touch the back of the hand that had summoned the shield. "You saved me, Lyra," he murmured, the admission carrying more weight than any royal decree. The shock of almost losing him, coupled with his unguarded sincerity, melted a layer of Lyra's carefully maintained frost. She saw not the king, but the man burdened by the fate of a kingdom. He then presented her with a small, intricately carved silver snowflake, suspended on a fine platinum chain. "This belonged to the first Iceborn queen," he explained, fastening it carefully around her neck. "It is not a crown, but a promise. It means I believe you can master this power. It means I am committed to your survival, just as you have proven committed to mine." This gift of ancestral belief was the true mate bond, a commitment based on mutual protection and unwavering faith, not mere physical claim. Lyra touched the silver, its cold metal a comforting mirror to her own nature. The tension between them was no longer purely sexual or political. It was a bond forged in shared danger and necessary trust. The whispers in the citadel had turned to open panic. The tremors were no longer isolated incidents. They were nearly constant, accompanied by unnatural, bone-chilling ice storms that ravaged the Frostwind borders. Villages were cut off by impassable drifts, and the reports from the guard were grim. The shadow wolves, grotesque creatures formed from pure void energy leaking from the rift, were growing bolder, attacking scouting patrols and leaving behind only frozen, hollowed-out remains. Kaelith, rarely seen outside his strategic maps room, worked until exhaustion, but the crisis was escalating faster than his military could contain it. Lyra stood at the high window looking out over the kingdom now choked by endless snow, realizing the true, horrific scale of the danger. The rift wasn't a crack. It was a hungry maw, and she had spent years running from the very power needed to choke it shut. Her iceborn magic, once a tool for solitary defense, was now the only offensive weapon against the encroaching darkness. Valerius's sneering criticisms and the council's doubt faded into background noise. The only thing that mattered was the survival of the people she had come to protect. The fate of the entire civilization rested on her mastering a power she had always sworn to contain. She turned from the window, the ancestral snowflake cold against her collarbone, and walked straight to Kaelith's war room. There would be no more hesitation. She had to risk everything, her life, her sanity, and the full, terrifying might of the Iceborn magic to face the summit. The time for training was over. The ascent to the summit was brutal, a nightmare ride through a churning blizzard that Kaelith barely navigated. When they reached the peak, the wind was dead, replaced by a suffocating, unnatural cold that signaled the presence of the rift. Before them, the sky was tearing open, a massive, swirling void, black and edged with malevolent energy, disgorging shrieking shadow wolves onto the sacred ground. Kaelith gave no command, only a guttural roar as he shifted into his enormous wolf form, throwing himself and the royal guard into the melee to hold the line. Lyra ignored the carnage. She walked toward the yawning maw of the rift, the scent of annihilation thick in the air. This was the moment she had run from all her life. The terror of her own potential was immense, but the threat to the kingdom was greater. She drew on the deepest, most volatile core of the Iceborn power, pushing past all her control limitations. It was pure agony, feeling the world's fundamental cold flow through her veins, yet she drove it harder. With a silent, absolute command of will, a brilliant crystalline wave of absolute zero erupted from her. It didn't just freeze, it crystallized. The shadow wolves were instantly encased in brittle, translucent ice, shattering the immediate threat. The void itself hesitated, and in that precious second, Lyra channeled the whole of her existence into a single blinding torrent of condensed ice energy. The rift shrieked its protest as the Iceborn power slammed into its core. With a sound like a glacier splitting in two, the void snapped shut, sealed by Lyra's unprecedented, controlled might. She collapsed onto the freezing rock, the deafening silence of victory ringing in her ears. Lyra drifted back to consciousness, the scent of antiseptic herbs replacing the sharp ozone of the rift. She was in her chambers, healed, but fundamentally changed. The fear of her power was gone, replaced by the surety of its control. News of her unprecedented feat had swept the kingdom, silencing the dissenters. In the Great Hall, the High Council convened one last time. Beta Prime Valerius tried to cling to his power, arguing that Lyra's recklessness must be punished, but his voice was drowned out by the thunderous collective roar of the shifters who had witnessed the rift's closure, and the thousands more whose lives she had saved. Valerius was exposed as the source of the assassination plot and stripped of his rank. Kaelith, in his full ceremonial armor, then approached Lyra. He didn't just stand before her. He knelt, a profound gesture that shocked the entire court. He placed the true diamond-crusted crown of the Luna upon her head. "You proved," he stated, his voice resonating through the hall, "that the cold required to save us was not the ice of tyranny, but the clarity of the Iceborn. You are our queen, Lyra, my queen." He stood, offering his hand. Lyra, meeting his gaze, no longer saw a cold strategist, but a true partner forged in crisis. She accepted the mate bond not out of necessity but out of choice, embracing her destiny as the Iceborn queen. The rejected anomaly had found her purpose and her home,